Close your eyes. Let the noise of the day find somewhere else to be. Not all at once, just slowly. The way a room grows quiet after the last person leaves, and you realize, for the first time in hours, that you can finally breathe. Maybe tonight you are tired in a way that is hard to name. Not just the tiredness that comes from a long day, the deeper kind. The kind that has been accumulating for longer than you can remember. From carrying things that were heavy and showing up anyway. From trying to hold together a life that sometimes feels like it is asking more of you than you have left to give. If that is where you are tonight, I want you to know something before we begin. You are not the first person to feel that way. The people in this story felt it too. The women who walked to a tomb before sunrise because they did not know what else to do. The men who locked the doors and sat in the dark because the thing they had built their lives around had ended on a Friday afternoon. The one who prayed alone in a garden while his closest friends fell asleep around him. They were tired too. And what happened to them in the middle of their tiredness? In the middle of a week that asked everything of them and gave back things they had not expected, is what we are going to walk through together tonight. This is Holy Week. 7 days that changed everything. Not as a lesson to be absorbed before sleep, but as a story to be walked through slowly. The way you walk through something that is too large to be taken in all at once. Breathe. You are safe here. Let us begin. Spring in Judea arrived the same way it always had. Quietly. Then all at once. The almond trees bloomed first, their white flowers appearing before the leaves. Then the hillsides turned green after the winter rains. And then the roads began to fill. Because Passover was coming. In the first century, Passover was not simply a religious observance. It was the single most significant event in the Jewish calendar. The moment when every Jewish man within a reasonable distance of Jerusalem was expected, by tradition and by law, to make the journey to the city. They came from Galilee in the north, from communities scattered across the Roman world, from villages and farms and fishing towns that were weeks of travel away, from Alexandria and Antioch and Rome itself. Families and merchants and pilgrims who had been planning this journey since the rains stopped and the roads became passable again. Ancient writers like Josephus, who recorded what he knew of Jerusalem's infrastructure and its capacity, suggest figures for the Passover crowds that strain the modern imagination. Some accounts reaching toward the hundreds of thousands who would press into a city already dense with its ordinary population. What is not disputed is this: the roads into Jerusalem during Passover were crowded in a way that happened at no other time of year. Every road leading toward the city filled with pilgrims, families walking together. The older ones who had made this journey many times, and the younger ones for whom everything was still new. The sound would have been extraordinary. Sandals on stone roads. The lowing of animals being brought for sacrifice. Children asking questions that parents answered from memory, because their parents had answered the same questions when they were children. And rising above all of it, a sound that may be the most ancient continuous sound in human religious history. Singing. The Psalms of Ascent. Psalms 120 through 134 were composed specifically for this journey. Pilgrims sang them as they climbed the roads toward the city. I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. These were not performance songs. They were walking songs, the kind meant to carry a person's weight when the road is long and the destination still far. Ancient words worn smooth by generations of use, passed from parent to child like a hand reaching back across time. Jesus and his disciples had been in Galilee. The journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, depending on the route taken, covered somewhere between 70 and 100 miles on foot, most pilgrims following the Jordan River Valley south, dropping through the flat land of the valley floor before climbing back up through the Judean wilderness toward the city. Several days of walking. Several days of joining the great river of pilgrims flowing toward the feast. He had made this journey before. Every year of his life as a faithful Jewish man, he would have walked these roads toward Passover. He knew the particular quality of the light in the Judean hills in spring. He knew what Jerusalem looked like from a distance when you finally crested the last ridge and the city came into view. The temple complex, catching the morning sun in a way that ancient writers compared to a mountain covered in snow. But this year was different. He knew it was different. This is the part of the story that deserves to be held carefully before we move forward. Because it is easy to read what happened next and miss the full weight of it. Jesus had told his disciples more than once what was waiting for him in Jerusalem. He had told them plainly, months before, that he would be handed over to the chief priests, that he would be condemned, that he would be killed, and that on the third day he would rise. The disciples had heard the words and had not been able to take them in. Peter had pulled him aside and said, with the fierce protectiveness of someone who has decided the person he loves will not be hurt, these things must never happen to you. They could not reconcile what he was saying with what they expected the Messiah to be. In their imagination, in the imagination of almost everyone in Judea, the Messiah was a conqueror, the one who would finally end the long humiliation of Roman occupation and restore the throne of David. A man who talked about being handed over and killed was not fitting the shape of that story. But he knew. He walked toward Jerusalem knowing what the week would contain. And he walked toward it anyway, not because he had no choice, because this was the reason he had come. Breathe. Let that sit for a moment. A man walking knowingly toward the hardest thing imaginable, with clear eyes and a settled purpose. Because on the other side of it was something that could not be reached any other way. Most of us, when we see something hard ahead of us, look for a way around it. He looked at it directly and kept walking. The group traveled south through the Jordan Valley as the land around them changed. The greenness of the river corridor giving way to the dramatic arid landscapes of the Judean wilderness. The limestone hills rising in shades of ochre and white, under a sky that in spring is a particular shade of blue that feels almost deliberate. Ahead of them, the road climbed. Behind them, other pilgrims. Above them, the same sky that had hung over this road for 1,000 years of Passover journeys. And the songs. Always the songs, rising from different groups at different points on the road, weaving together into something larger than any one voice. He walked toward Jerusalem knowing what was waiting. He walked in the company of people who loved him and did not yet understand. He walked through a landscape saturated with the memory of his own people's story. And he walked through it singing. There is something in that worth carrying into sleep tonight. The road was long. The destination was known. The songs were sung anyway. Not because the difficulty wasn't real, but because the journey required them. Rest now. You are at the beginning of the week. Tomorrow, we stop in Jericho. And the people the crowd has decided don't matter will discover that someone is paying attention after all. Jericho sits in a basin of extraordinary greenness. Carved into the floor of the Jordan Valley, roughly 850 feet below sea level, one of the lowest inhabited places on Earth. Spring water rises there from ancient underground sources, turning the surrounding landscape lush in a way that the surrounding desert makes feel almost miraculous. Date palms, bougainvillea, the smell of water in dry air. Travelers arriving from the long stretch of the Jordan Valley had been stopping in Jericho for thousands of years, and by the 1st century it had become a prosperous town, wealthy enough that Herod the Great had built a winter palace there. Drawn by the same mild climate and reliable water that had made the city valuable since the earliest records of human habitation. The road from Jericho to Jerusalem climbs steeply through the Judean wilderness, gaining more than 3,000 feet in elevation over roughly 17 miles. The terrain through which that road winds, narrow passes, rocky hillsides, exposed ridges with little shade, gave it a reputation among 1st century travelers as dangerous ground. Jesus himself had said a parable on exactly this road. A man attacked by bandits while traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, left half dead in the dust, until a Samaritan stopped to help when everyone else had passed by. He chose that road deliberately. His audience knew it. They knew what it meant to be alone and vulnerable on a road where no one stopped. He arrived in Jericho with his disciples and the crowd of pilgrims that had gathered around him on the journey south. Word moved ahead of groups like his. A teacher was coming. A healer. The one people had been talking about since Galilee. By the time Jesus entered the city, the streets were lined with people wanting to see him. And somewhere in that crowd, in the particular way that significant moments in this story so often pivot around a small and almost absurd detail, a short man climbed a tree. His name was Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector of Jericho, meaning he had not merely accepted a contract with Rome to collect taxes from his neighbors. He had built an organization around it. He employed others beneath him. He had made himself wealthy through a system that the people around him experienced as exploitation dressed in official clothing. Tax collectors in first-century Judea occupied a place in their community's social imagination that is difficult to fully convey across 2,000 years of distance. They were not simply unpopular. They were considered to have traded something essential: their belonging to their people, their standing before God, for money and proximity to Roman power. They were excluded from synagogue life. They could not serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. In the eyes of their neighbors, they had placed themselves beyond the reach of ordinary respectability. Zacchaeus was short, and the crowd was not inclined to make room for him. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see above the heads of everyone who had decided he did not deserve a view. Jesus came down the road below him. He stopped. He looked up into the branches, and he said, not as an invitation, but as a simple statement of fact, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." The crowd's reaction is easy to imagine because Luke records it plainly. They grumbled. He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. The word used implies someone publicly, categorically known to be outside the bounds of acceptable community life. They were not wrong about what Zacchaeus had done. They were wrong about whether that placed him beyond reach. Zacchaeus came down from the tree, standing before Jesus. Something broke open in him that the text does not explain and does not need to. He said he would give half of everything he owned to the poor, and for anything he had defrauded anyone, 4 times the amount back. Jesus said, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham," not after he had proven himself, not after a probationary period. Today, in the moment of turning, in the presence of the one who had looked up into the tree and seen him before he had done anything to deserve being seen. The crowd had decided who Zacchaeus was. Jesus had decided something different. And the gap between those two decisions is one of the most consistent themes running through everything that happens in the days ahead. They left Jericho and began the long climb toward Jerusalem, somewhere on the road out of the city, or perhaps near the gate. The gospel accounts differ slightly in their geography. A man was sitting. His name was Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. He was blind. He sat beside the road the way blind beggars sat in the first century, in a fixed location, dependent on the charity of passers-by. His existence structured entirely around the willingness of strangers to notice him and stop. The Passover crowd was not stopping. The road out of Jericho on the day a famous teacher was passing through was not a place where anyone had much patience for interruption. People had places to be. The feast was coming. The city was waiting. Bartimaeus heard the noise of the crowd and asked what was happening. They told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by," and something in him recognized, not tentatively, not with the careful hedging of a man who has been disappointed before, that this was the moment. He began to shout above the crowd noise, above the sandals on stone and the murmur of hundreds of people in motion, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The title mattered. Son of David was not a casual form of address. It was a messianic designation, a claim about who Jesus was, spoken publicly, loudly, by a beggar sitting in the road. The people nearest to him told him to be quiet. He shouted louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped. The entire crowd stopped with him. He said, "Call him." And the people who had just been telling Bartimaeus to be quiet suddenly changed their tone. "Take heart. Get up, he is calling you. Bartimaeus threw off his cloak. The one possession a beggar in the ancient world would guard carefully. The thing he slept under and lived inside. Threw it off and ran toward the voice that had called him. Jesus asked him a question. What do you want me to do for you? It might seem obvious. The man was blind. But there is something in the asking that refuses to be hurried past. Jesus did not assume. He did not perform the healing before the request was made. He wanted to hear it said. Wanted this man who had spent his entire life being passed by to be heard by someone who was actually fully listening. Not managed. Not processed. Heard. Rabbi. Let me recover my sight. And Bartimaeus could see. He followed Jesus on the road now climbing out of Jericho and heading up through the wilderness toward Jerusalem. He joined the pilgrims, already moving, already singing. He had spent years sitting beside this road, listening to other people walk past him toward their destinations. Now he was walking himself, following the voice that had stopped when no one else would. Breathe. Let those two stories settle together for a moment. Because placed side by side, they are saying something important about the kind of kingdom that was about to enter Jerusalem. A wealthy man at the top of his profession, despised by his community, sitting in a tree because the crowd would not make room for him. A blind beggar at the bottom of everything, sitting in the dust because he had no other option. Silenced by the crowd when he tried to speak. Two men on opposite ends of every scale that first-century society used to measure worth. And Jesus stopped for both of them, not for the crowd, not for the impressive or the powerful or the ones whose approval would have been useful. For the man in the tree and the man in the road. The disciples had been arguing among themselves, in the weeks before this final journey, about which of them would sit at Jesus' right hand in the coming kingdom. They were thinking about rank and honor and positioning. He was stopping for blind beggars and climbing tax collectors and asking people what they wanted before he healed them. These were not isolated acts of individual kindness, added as a warm-up before the real work of the week began. They were the shape of the kingdom itself, made visible in specific human moments, on a specific road, on a specific afternoon. The kingdom of God looked like Jesus looking up into a sycamore tree. It looked like a crowd finally making room for someone they had just told to be quiet. It looked like a cloak thrown off in the road, and a man running toward the voice that had said his name. He left Jericho with his disciples and the growing crowd of Passover pilgrims. The road climbed into the wilderness. The singing continued. The ancient psalms carrying their weight up through the limestone hills the way they always had. The way they always would. Jerusalem was a day's walk ahead. Everything that would happen there was already in motion. But before Jerusalem, there was Bethany. And Bethany is where the story truly begins to gather its weight. Rest now. The road is long, and the city is still ahead. You have seen what kind of king is coming. The kind who looks up. The kind who stops. The kind who asks what you want before he does anything about it. Sleep well. Tomorrow we reach the village on the hillside, and the table is already being set. The road crests the eastern ridge of the Mount of Olives, and Bethany appears. A small village tucked into the hillside, roughly 2 miles from Jerusalem. Close enough to see the temple's white stone catching the light on clear mornings. Far enough to feel like somewhere else entirely. It was not a wealthy place. It was not strategically significant. It had no particular claim on history before this week. But across all 4 gospel accounts, Bethany emerges as the place Jesus returned to every evening during Holy Week. The place he chose to sleep, to rest, to be known by name rather than by reputation. That detail is easy to read past and worth refusing to. He could have stayed in Jerusalem. The city was full of Passover pilgrims, many of whom would have offered him a room without hesitation. Instead, each evening, he walked the 2 miles back over the ridge to this small village. He went home, not to a palace or a place of honor, to a house where people set a place for him at the table and were genuinely glad to see him come through the door. The family he returned to was one the gospel writers clearly consider worth knowing. Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus lived in Bethany. Martha was the one who organized things, who kept the household running, who once stood in a kitchen doorway and complained to Jesus that her sister was sitting at his feet, listening instead of helping with the meal. Mary was the one who sat, who listened, who chose what Jesus himself called the better part, and refused to be talked out of it. Lazarus was the brother, the one Jesus, when told he was sick, had delayed going to, and then wept over, and then called out of the tomb after 4 days in the ground. That last detail had consequences that went far beyond one family's grief turned to wonder. The raising of Lazarus had not been a private event. Many people had been present. Many of those people had gone directly to the Pharisees and told them what they had seen. The Gospel of John makes the chain of events explicit. It was the raising of Lazarus that pushed the chief priests and Pharisees into a formal decision. A man who could raise the dead was a man they could no longer afford to leave unchallenged. If we let him go on like this, they said, everyone will believe in him. The high priest Caiaphas framed it in cold political terms. Better for one man to die than for the whole nation to be destabilized. The decision had been made, and Jesus came back to Bethany. He came back to the house of the family he loved, in the village where the miracle that sealed his fate had occurred, on the nights before the week that would fulfill it. There is a particular kind of courage in that, not the dramatic courage of a confrontation, but the quieter courage of choosing to remain present in the place where the cost of your presence is already known. A few days before Palm Sunday, while Jesus was still in Bethany, something happened at a dinner that the Gospel writers considered significant enough to preserve in detail, and that may have planted the seed of one of the week's darkest turns. The dinner was held at the house of a man named Simon, called the leper, most likely someone Jesus had healed at some earlier point, the designation marking his history rather than his current condition. It was a gathering of some significance. Lazarus was there, reclining at the table. Martha was serving, and in the middle of the meal, a woman entered, carrying an alabaster flask of pure nard, an aromatic perfume imported from the Himalayan region, expensive enough that the disciples immediately began calculating its value. She broke the flask open and poured the entire contents over Jesus' head. The reaction was swift and sharp. Those present called it wasteful. The perfume could have been sold for a year's wages and the money given to the poor. The Gospel of John identifies Judas Iscariot as the one who pressed this objection most pointedly, and adds a note about his character that the reader is meant to hold. He was not asking out of concern for the poor. Jesus silenced the criticism with a directness that left no room for argument. Leave her alone. She has done a beautiful thing to me. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. For burial. He said it plainly, in a room full of people sharing a meal, as though the words were simply the next true thing to be spoken aloud. The woman had understood something the disciples had not yet been able to absorb, that the one sitting at the center of this dinner was moving toward death, and that this act of extravagant love was not waste, but preparation. What moved inside Judas between that dinner and the Wednesday that followed? The text does not tell us directly. What we know is that something shifted. A man who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had heard every teaching and witnessed every healing, who had been trusted with the group's money and with the daily realities of shared life on the road. That man went to the chief priests and asked what they would give him to hand Jesus over. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave under the law of Moses. He came back to Bethany each evening knowing this, knowing that one of the 12 was already in conversation with the people planning his arrest. He sat at the table in this house, ate with these people, rested in this village, carrying the knowledge of what was coming with a completeness of awareness that none of the others shared. The night air in Bethany would have been cool, the ancient olive trees of the Mount of Olives rising behind the village, their roots deeper than anyone's memory, the lights of Jerusalem visible from the higher ground, a city full of pilgrims who had come for the feast, unaware that what was approaching would redefine the feast forever. He knew what the morning would bring. He rested anyway. There is something in that worth carrying into sleep tonight. The full weight of what was coming did not prevent him from closing his eyes in Bethany. The knowledge of betrayal did not drive him from the table. He chose presence, chose rest, chose the company of people who loved him. Right up to the edge of the week that would ask everything, you are allowed to rest too. Whatever you are carrying, whatever you know is coming, the table is still set. The village is still quiet. Sleep well. Tomorrow, Jerusalem. The morning began quietly. It always does in the Gospels before something large happens. A stillness first. A moment where the world has not yet caught up to what is about to occur. And then everything moves at once. Jesus woke in Bethany. The village around him was already stirring. Passover week had arrived in earnest. And the roads into Jerusalem were filling before sunrise with pilgrims who wanted to reach the temple courts early, to find their footing in the city before the crowds became impossible to move through. The smell of cook fires, families gathering their things, the particular energy of a holy day that has been anticipated for weeks finally arriving. He called 2 of his disciples and gave them specific instructions. They were to go into the next village just ahead on the road. When they entered it, they would find a young donkey tied there, one that had never been ridden. They were to untie it and bring it. If anyone asked what they were doing, they were to say simply, "The Lord has need of it." The disciples went. They found the donkey exactly where he said it would be. The owners asked why they were untying it. They said what they had been told to say, and the owners let them take it without argument. This small detail is easy to read past, but the precision of it, the donkey in exactly the right place, the owners responding exactly as he had described, tells us something important about how Jesus moved through this week. He was not reacting to events as they unfolded. He was not being swept along by circumstance. He was walking a road he had already seen clearly, step by deliberate step. From the very beginning, they brought the donkey. They laid their cloaks across its back. He sat on it. And here we need to stop. What Jesus did in this moment was not simply choose a humble mode of transportation. He was doing something that anyone in that crowd who knew their scriptures would have recognized immediately. 500 years before this morning, the prophet Zechariah had written these exact words, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." 500 years. The Jewish people had carried this prophecy through exile and occupation, and through the long silence of centuries in which no prophet spoke and no word came. And now, a man from Galilee was riding a donkey down the Mount of Olives toward the eastern gate of Jerusalem, on the very morning that Passover lambs were being brought into the city for inspection before the feast. The crowd understood that something significant was happening, or they understood part of it. They began cutting branches from the palm trees and laying them on the road. They spread their cloaks on the ground before him, and they began to shout a word that has traveled through so many centuries of religious use that we have almost forgotten what it originally meant. Hosanna. In Hebrew, it is not a word of pure praise. It is a cry of urgent appeal, a word meaning, "Save us now." It was the sound of people who had been waiting a very long time for someone to come and make things right, and who believed, in this moment, that he had finally arrived. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. They were shouting it at the top of their voices as the procession moved down the slope of the Mount of Olives toward the city. Some historians studying the political context of first-century Jerusalem have noted a layer to this scene that sharpens its meaning considerably. During Passover week, when the city swelled with pilgrims and the potential for unrest was at its highest, the Roman governor would typically travel from his usual residence on the Mediterranean coast to Jerusalem with a visible military escort, a deliberate display of imperial authority, timed precisely for the most volatile week of the Jewish calendar. Horses, armor, the full visual vocabulary of Roman power, entering the city from the west, and on the other side of the city, entering from the east, a man on a borrowed donkey, surrounded by people laying cloaks in the road. Two processions. Two completely different answers to the question of what a king looks like. Two completely different visions of how the world gets saved. The crowd shouting Hosanna had lived their entire lives under the weight of the first kind of power. They were reaching, in this moment, toward something they could sense, but not yet fully name. The procession crested the Mount of Olives, and Jerusalem spread out below, the temple complex at the center of the city, gleaming white stone in the morning sun. By all ancient accounts, one of the most visually extraordinary structures in the world, filled the view. Jesus looked at it, and then he wept, not quiet, private tears. The Gospel of Luke uses a word describing open, audible weeping. He wept over the city and said, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes." He could see what they could not. He could see a city being offered something extraordinary in this moment, and that in the decades ahead would turn away from it in ways that would bring tremendous suffering. He spoke of days coming that many scholars connect to the Roman siege and destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. And he wept, not for himself, not because of what the week ahead held for him, but for them, for the city, for the people waving palm branches and shouting for a king, not yet understanding the depth of what was being offered. He loved them anyway. He rode into the city through the eastern gate. The Pharisees pushed through the crowd toward him. "Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Tell them to stop," he said. "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." He entered the temple courts. He looked around at everything there. The sellers, the money changers, the animals, the noise, and then, because it was already late in the day, he turned and walked back out of the city, back over the ridge, back to Bethany. The crowd that had shouted Hosanna dispersed into the packed streets. The palm branches remained on the road. The moment passed, or seemed to, but in rooms Jesus was not in. The people who ran the temple had seen everything. They had heard the titles being used. They had watched the procession come down the mountain. And now, for the first time, they understood that waiting was no longer an option. He was not in those rooms. He was in Bethany, resting. You can rest too. The stones would have cried out if the voices had stopped. That means what happened today was not incidental. It was written into the fabric of things long before the crowd gathered. Sleep well. Monday is coming, and the tables are about to turn. He came back into Jerusalem the next morning. The Passover crowds were still filling the city. The streets busy. The temple courts packed with pilgrims who had come from every direction to fulfill the requirements of the feast. The sellers were already at their tables in the outer courts. The money changers had their coins spread before them. The animals were in their pens. The business of Passover was fully underway. And Jesus walked in and overturned the tables. But the moment deserves more than a headline. Because what Jesus did on that Monday morning was not an impulsive act of anger that surprised even him. It was a deliberate challenge to an entire system. And to understand why, we need to understand what that system had become, and who it was costing the most. The temple complex that stood in Jerusalem in the 1st century was one of the most architecturally ambitious structures in the ancient world. Its outer courts were open to a much broader group of people than the inner sanctuary. At the very center was the place accessible only to priests. Around it were courts with increasingly restricted access. Jewish men could enter certain areas. Jewish women could enter others. And then, on the outermost level, was the area that many scholars refer to as the Court of the Gentiles. This outer court was the only part of the entire complex where non-Jewish people were permitted to enter. For devout Gentiles, for people from across the Roman world who had heard of the God of Israel and wanted to approach him, this outer court was the only sacred space available to them anywhere on earth. It was the place the prophet Isaiah had in mind when he wrote, centuries earlier, that God's house would be called a house of prayer for all peoples. All peoples. The outer court was designed to be the place where the edges of the world could come and stand in the presence of the God who made everything. It had been turned into a marketplace. The sellers of animals were there. Pigeons, doves, lambs, everything needed for the various offerings available for purchase, so that pilgrims who had traveled long distances did not have to bring their own. The money changers were there because the temple tax had to be paid in a specific currency, meaning pilgrims arriving with Roman coins had to exchange them first. There was a logic to all of it. Practical services provided for practical needs, but the space intended for the one group with the least access had been filled entirely with commerce. The noise and smell of a livestock market occupied the ground where prayer was supposed to be possible. The only people with no other option had been effectively crowded out of the only space they were permitted to use. Here is the detail that changes everything about how we read Monday morning. The evening before, Palm Sunday, Jesus had entered the temple courts after riding into the city. Mark and Luke both record it. He looked around at everything there. And then, because it was already late, he left and returned to Bethany. He saw the marketplace on Sunday. He spent the night in Bethany. He came back on Monday with intention. This means what happened was not a reaction. It was not a moment of passion that overcame him when he walked in and was surprised by what he found. He had seen it. He had slept on it. He returned the next morning having already decided. That distinction matters enormously. Impulse acts before it thinks. What Jesus did on Monday required sleeping on it, waking up, and choosing to go back, knowing that going back would accelerate everything the religious authorities were already planning. He entered the outer court and drove out the sellers and buyers. He overturned the tables of the money changers, coins scattering across the stone floor. He overturned the seats of those who sold doves. He would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the courts. And then he placed two passages of scripture side by side in a way that cut to the heart of what this was really about. From Isaiah, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." From Jeremiah, "But you have made it a den of robbers." All peoples. The space meant for those with no other option had been taken from them. He made it back. And then, almost as an aside in Matthew's account, easy to miss in the drama of the overturned tables, something happened that may be the quietest and most beautiful moment in the entire Holy Week narrative. After he had cleared the outer court, the blind and the lame came to him there, and he healed them in the space he had just made. These were people excluded not only from the inner courts but from the temple's central life entirely. Physical impairment placed them outside the purity standards of the time. They had always been on the outside of the outside. And now, in the space that had just been cleared, they came to him. He healed them there, in the court of the Gentiles, in the only part of the temple complex that had been designed for everyone, in the space that commerce had stolen and he had restored. The chief priests and scribes saw all of it. The overturned tables, the healings, the children in the courts shouting Hosanna to the Son of David. They came to Jesus and said, "Do you hear what these are saying?" He answered with Psalm 8, as though the question had already been answered long before this morning. "Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise." They left, but they did not go far. And they did not forget. The religious leaders had now watched 2 consecutive days of deliberate, public challenge to the world they controlled. Sunday, a messianic procession into the city. Monday, the clearing of the temple courts. Each act carried out in full view of the Passover crowds. Each one a direct claim, not spoken in argument, but enacted in public, about who held authority over the things they considered theirs. They would begin planning in earnest now. The question was no longer whether to act, but how. How to do it without igniting the crowd that currently considered Jesus a prophet. He was not in those conversations. He walked back to Bethany in the evening, back over the ridge, back to the house and the table, and the people who were glad to see him. He had made room for the ones who had no room. He had healed in the space he had cleared. And then he went home and rested. You are allowed to do the same. to be fully present in the hard moments the day requires, and then to come home, to set it down, to let the evening be evening. He did both. Sleep now. Tuesday is coming. And Tuesday will be the longest day of the week. If you had been in Jerusalem on this particular Tuesday morning and made your way to the temple courts, you would have found what looked on the surface like a public debate. A teacher, surrounded by crowds, religious leaders approaching one by one with carefully prepared questions, an audience listening to every exchange with the particular attention of people who understand that something important is being decided in front of them. But this was not a debate. This was an interrogation, and everyone in that courtyard knew it. Tuesday of Holy Week is the longest and most intellectually dense day in the entire gospel narrative. More of Jesus' recorded words come from this single day than from almost any other period in his ministry. He taught. He was challenged. He responded. He challenged back. He answered questions designed to trap him and asked one question no one could answer. He told stories that cut so deep the people they were aimed at understood immediately. They were about them. All of this on a single Tuesday. In the open courts of a temple where the men who wanted him dead were watching from a careful distance. The first wave came quickly. The chief priests and elders approached with a question about authority. By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority? They meant the clearing of the temple. They meant the healings, the procession, the whole disruptive presence he had brought into their carefully ordered world. The question was a trap with two jaws. If he named a divine source, they would call it blasphemy. If he named a human one, they could dismiss him entirely. He answered their question with a question. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from man? And they were stuck. If they said from heaven, he would ask why they had not believed John. If they said from man, the crowd, which held John as a prophet, would turn against them. They said they did not know. He said, "Then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." He had not evaded the question. He had revealed the nature of the questioners. They were not asking because they wanted truth. They were asking because they wanted leverage. And he had shown the crowd exactly what was happening without a single direct accusation. Then came the parable. A landowner plants a vineyard, leases it to tenants, and goes away. At harvest time he sends servants to collect the fruit. The tenants beat them, kill them. Finally, the landowner sends his own son, thinking they will surely respect him. The tenants see the son coming and say, "This is the heir. Let us kill him and take his inheritance." They throw him out and kill him. Jesus asked what the landowner would do to those tenants. The chief priests and elders answered without thinking, "He will bring those wretches to a miserable end." They had pronounced their own judgment before they realized what they were doing. He quoted Psalm 118 back at them. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And they understood the parable was about them. They wanted to arrest him immediately. They feared the crowd. The second wave arrived, with a different strategy. The Pharisees sent their disciples alongside members of the Herodians, two groups that shared nothing politically and would never ordinarily have been seen together. The only thing uniting them this Tuesday was the shared desire to neutralize this teacher from Galilee. They came with what they believed was a perfect trap. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Say, yes. And he loses the crowd that resents Roman taxation. Say no. And he can be reported to Rome as an insurrectionist. He said, "Show me the coin for the tax." Someone produced a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription is this? Caesar's. Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. They marveled and left. What he had done was not a clever dodge. It was a profound reorientation. The coin bears Caesar's image. Give Caesar what bears his image. But what bears God's image? Anyone who knew Genesis knew the answer immediately. Human beings. Render to God what bears his image. Render yourself. The third wave came from the Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy who accepted only the first 5 books of Moses as scripture and did not believe in resurrection. They arrived with a scenario designed to make resurrection look absurd. A woman who married 7 brothers in succession, each dying without children. In the resurrection, whose wife would she be? He said, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. In the resurrection, people will not marry as they do now. And as for resurrection itself, God said to Moses at the burning bush, 'I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not I was. I am.' God is not the God of the dead, but of the living." The crowd was astonished. Then a scribe came forward. Unlike the others, he appeared to be asking genuinely, "Which commandment is the most important of all?" This was a question Jewish scholars had wrestled with for generations. Jesus answered without hesitation, "Love God with everything you have, and love your neighbor as yourself." The scribe said he was right. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." Not far. Not there yet, but not far. A man who asked an honest question received an honest answer, and had the integrity to agree publicly in a crowd that was mostly hostile to the man he was agreeing with. Jesus recognized it immediately. After that, no one dared ask him any more questions. So he turned to the crowd and spoke on his own terms. About teachers of the law who loved the best seats at banquets, while exploiting the vulnerable in private. About religion that performs itself publicly while doing damage quietly. Then he sat down near the offering box and watched people bring their contributions. Many wealthy people put in large amounts. A widow came and dropped in 2 small copper coins, worth a fraction of a penny. He called his disciples over and said, "This poor widow has put in more than all of them." They gave out of their abundance. She gave out of her poverty, everything she had to live on. On a day filled with elaborate theological arguments and public confrontations between powerful men, he stopped and pointed to a widow with 2 coins, and said she had given more than all of them. That is the shape of the kingdom this king keeps describing. Not the loudest argument, not the most impressive display, the quiet, costly act performed by the person no one was watching. He left the temple. The disciples pointed out the grandeur of the buildings around them. He said, "Not one stone here will be left on another." And they walked out into the afternoon light toward the Mount of Olives, where the longest day of the week was not yet finished. Rest now. Tuesday is not over. But the crowds have gone home, and the evening is quieter. You have walked through a day that would have exhausted most people before noon. Sleep well. Tomorrow the hillside conversation continues. And then Wednesday brings a silence unlike anything else in this story. They walked out of the city as the afternoon light began to soften. The temple complex behind them, still gleaming, still enormous, still the center of everything, the religious world of Jerusalem orbited around. Ahead of them, the Mount of Olives rising on the eastern side of the Kidron Valley. Its slopes covered in ancient olive trees, whose roots went deeper than anyone's memory. They crossed the valley and climbed the hillside and sat down. 4 disciples came to him privately: Peter, James, John, and Andrew. They had been turning over what he said as they walked. Not one stone will be left on another. They wanted to understand it. They asked him 2 questions. When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? What followed is known as the Olivet Discourse, the longest uninterrupted teaching Jesus gave outside the upper room, delivered on a hillside, with Jerusalem spread out below them in the fading afternoon light. He wove together things that were near and things that were far, events that would unfold within a generation, and events that belonged to a horizon no one in that conversation could yet see. The full interpretation of what he said has occupied careful readers for 2,000 years and will not be settled here. But certain things, he said, cut through every layer of interpretation and reach across the centuries with their full force intact. He began with warnings. There would be those who came claiming to be him, claiming to speak for him, claiming to be the fulfillment of the promises he was making. Do not be led astray. Wars would come, and rumors of wars. Nations rising against nations. Earthquakes, famines. He said these things were not the end, but the beginning. The early labor pains of something larger still to come. See that you are not alarmed. He spoke about persecution. His followers would be handed over to councils, brought before governors and kings, hated by all nations because of his name. He said this not to frighten them but to prepare them. And then he said something that reframes the entire picture of suffering. The one who endures to the end will be saved. Not the one who avoids difficulty. Not the one who escapes. The one who endures. Faithfulness measured not in the absence of hardship, but in what a person does while inside it. He spoke about Jerusalem. Many scholars connect his words here to the Roman siege of 70 AD. The devastation that would come upon the city within a generation of this conversation. He described it with the specificity of someone who could see it clearly. A time of great tribulation. A suffering unlike anything before it. He told those who would be in Judea when it came to flee to the mountains without stopping to gather their things. The urgency of his language suggested something that would move faster than preparation. And then he spoke about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Language drawn directly from the prophet Daniel. Imagery that his Jewish listeners would have understood as reaching far beyond any local or historical event. He was holding near and far together simultaneously, refusing to let the disciples reduce the conversation to a single timeline or a single event. In the middle of all of it, he said something that cuts through every century of interpretation and lands with the same weight it carried on that hillside. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Everything that seemed permanent, the temple his disciples had just been admiring, the city visible below them, the empire whose coins they carried, none of it was the fixed point. His words were the fixed point, the thing that would remain when everything else had been shaken loose. Then he turned to the question of readiness, because knowing the signs was not the point. The point was what a person did while waiting. He told the parable of the 10 virgins. 5, who brought extra oil for their lamps against a long wait. 5, who brought only what they had. The bridegroom was delayed. All 10 fell asleep. When he finally came at midnight, 5 had oil enough to trim their lamps and go into the wedding feast. 5 did not, and the door was shut. The lesson was not about planning ahead in a practical sense. It was about the kind of sustained, living readiness that cannot be borrowed from someone else at the last moment. You cannot transfer your faithfulness. You cannot borrow someone else's oil when the hour finally comes. He told the parable of the talents. A master entrusting resources to 3 servants before a long journey. 2 invested what they were given and doubled it. 1 buried his out of fear, preserving exactly what he had been given and nothing more. The master's response to the one who buried his was sharp, not neutral, not forgivable, but a failure of a specific kind. The failure of fear mistaken for safety. What was given was meant to be used, risked, put to work in the world. He told the parable of the faithful and the wicked servant. One found doing his master's work when the master returned unexpectedly. The other, assuming the delay meant the master would never come. Stay awake, he kept saying, in different forms and through different images. Be ready. Be found faithful when the moment comes. Not ready in the sense of having everything figured out. Ready in the sense of still doing the work. Still tending the light. Still using what you have been given. When the door opens, the teaching was finished. The sun had moved far toward the western hills. Jerusalem below them was settling into the particular golden light of a spring evening. The temple complex, casting long shadows across the city. He came down from the hillside with his 4 disciples and rejoined the others. They walked together back over the ridge toward Bethany in the gathering dark. It had been the longest day. More words spoken. More challenges met. More ground covered in a single Tuesday than most teachers covered in a year. He had answered every trap without losing himself. He had spoken about the end of the age without losing sight of the widow with 2 coins. He had warned about false messiahs without becoming dramatic about his own identity. He had held the near and the far together with a steadiness that the disciples, still confused, still asking the wrong questions, could not yet fully receive. And then he walked home in the evening, over the Mount of Olives, through the olive trees, back to Bethany. The same rhythm, every night of this week. Full presence in the hard moments. Deliberate return to rest when the hard moments were done. You are allowed to carry that rhythm into tonight. Whatever the day required of you, it is finished now. The teaching is over. The hillside is quiet. The city is growing dark below. Sleep now. Wednesday is coming. And Wednesday is a silence that has its own things to say. There is a Wednesday in Holy Week. Most people know this in theory but tend to skip past it on the way to Thursday, to the upper room, the Last Supper, and everything that follows. Wednesday feels like a corridor between the intensity of Tuesday and the weight of what is coming. A day without a headline event. A day the gospel writers move through quickly, or in some accounts do not address at all. But Wednesday is not empty. Wednesday is a silence. And silences in this story are rarely accidental. What we know about Wednesday can be stated simply. Almost nothing was recorded. No teaching in the temple courts. No confrontations with religious authorities. No crowds pressing around him. Every other day of this week has specific events, specific words, specific encounters anchored to specific places. Wednesday has almost none of that. It is a blank in a narrative that is otherwise extraordinarily detailed. And blanks in carefully constructed accounts always invite reflection. What we do know is this. Somewhere in Jerusalem on Wednesday, Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests. He walked into a room where the people planning Jesus' arrest were meeting and asked a direct question. "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" They counted out 30 pieces of silver. From that moment, Matthew tells us, Judas was looking for the right opportunity. 30 pieces of silver. It is one of those details that has become so familiar through centuries of retelling that it has almost lost its weight. In the context of the first century, 30 shekels was the amount specified in the book of Exodus as compensation for a slave who had been killed. The standard payment for the lowest category of human life under the law. It communicated something precise about how much the chief priests valued the man they wanted eliminated. And Judas took it. We need to sit with Judas for a moment. Not to excuse what he did. The gospel writers do not excuse it, and neither should we. But because he deserves to be understood as a human being, rather than simply as a symbol of betrayal. And because attempting to understand him reveals something important about the nature of this week. Judas was not an outsider who infiltrated the group. He was one of the 12. He had been with Jesus from the beginning of the Galilean ministry, present for every teaching, every healing, every meal shared on the road. He had been trusted with the group's finances, which suggests he was considered reliable, organized, responsible. He had sat at table with Jesus night after night over 3 years of traveling together, through Galilee and Samaria and Judea, through the early enthusiasm of the crowds and the growing hostility of the authorities. Whatever led him to that room on Wednesday was not the decision of a stranger. It was the decision of someone who knew Jesus as well as almost anyone alive. What broke? Scholars and theologians have debated this for 2,000 years without arriving at a single answer that satisfies everyone. Some have pointed to what the Gospel of John records about his character. A man whose relationship with money had become corrupted somewhere along the way. Others have suggested something more ideological, that Judas may have believed genuinely in the coming kingdom, but had grown increasingly frustrated that Jesus kept refusing to act with political force. That perhaps he thought engineering a confrontation between Jesus and the authorities would force a crisis that Jesus would then resolve by finally revealing his power in an unmistakable, undeniable way. If something like that was his thinking, he was about to discover how completely he had misread everything. But on Wednesday, none of that has happened yet. On Wednesday, Judas has made his decision and is waiting. The other 11 do not know. They are in Bethany, resting, perhaps processing the extraordinary intensity of the past 3 days. Not knowing that in a room somewhere in Jerusalem, 30 coins have just been counted out, and a transaction has been completed. And Jesus, wherever he spent that Wednesday, knew. The Gospel of John makes this explicit throughout its account. Jesus was not surprised by what Judas did. He had known for some time. He had continued to include Judas, to walk beside him, to eat with him, to carry the full knowledge of what was coming without turning Judas away from the table. That is almost impossible to fully comprehend. To know that someone you have chosen, someone you have loved and traveled with for years, is in the process of trading your life for the price of a slave, and to continue to offer him your company, to let him stay. There is a particular kind of loneliness in carrying knowledge that no one around you shares. The knowledge of what is coming, and the knowledge of who is carrying it toward you, and the choice to remain present and open despite knowing both things simultaneously. Wednesday, for Jesus, may have been the day that loneliness was at its most complete. Some scholars suggest he may have spent the day in Bethany, resting entirely, that the sustained intensity of Sunday through Tuesday had been physically and emotionally demanding in ways that required genuine withdrawal. Others suggest he may have withdrawn to the hillside to pray, the way he had always withdrawn before the great moments of his ministry. Before choosing the 12 disciples, he had prayed through an entire night on a mountain. The Mount of Olives was close. The olive groves were quiet. We do not know. The silence holds its secret. What Wednesday is doing in the shape of this story may matter more than what specifically occurred within it. Holy Week is not structured like a theological argument with a thesis and supporting points. It is structured like a life, with its loud public confrontations and its private interior silences, and looking at the rhythm of the week, the escalating tension of Sunday through Tuesday, then Wednesday's silence, then the profound weight of Thursday evening onward. The silence is doing something essential. It is breathing, the inhale before the longest exhale, the stillness in which whatever needed to settle before the final movement could settle. Your life has Wednesdays too, days that feel like nothing is happening, days that seem like corridors between the moments that matter, days when the significant things are behind you and the next significant thing has not yet arrived, and you are simply in the middle, in the ordinary, in the quiet, in the space between. Wednesday is not nothing. Wednesday may be where some of the most important things happen, the things that have no audience, that leave no record, that exist only between you and whatever you are trusting in the silence. He was present in that silence. He is present in yours. 30 coins were counted out in a room he was not in. The transaction was complete, and somewhere in Bethany, or on a hillside above the city, or in the quiet of an olive grove in the last afternoon light, he rested, he prayed, he carried what he carried, and he was still there in the morning. Let tonight be a Wednesday if it needs to be. Let the silence be silence. Let the room be still. You do not need to resolve anything before you sleep, or understand anything, or produce anything. Simply be present in the quiet, the way he was present, carrying what you carry, trusting what you trust. Sleep now. Thursday is coming, and Thursday will ask everything of us. Thursday arrived the way significant days often arrive, without announcement, without the sky changing color or the air carrying any particular warning. Just the ordinary beginning of a morning in Bethany. The light coming up over the eastern hills. The sound of the city in the distance, already stirring with the preparations of the most important evening of the Jewish year. Because tonight was the Passover, not the week of Passover in the general sense, which had already begun. Tonight was the specific night when every Jewish family in Jerusalem and throughout the known world would gather around a table, eat the prescribed meal, drink the prescribed cups of wine, recite the prescribed words, and remember the night that had defined them as a people, the night in Egypt, centuries before, when the angel of death had passed over the homes marked with the blood of a lamb, the night of liberation, the night that had made them who they were. The lamb had to be brought to the temple that afternoon. The unleavened bread had to be prepared. Everything had to be ready before sundown. When the meal would begin, and Jesus turned to two of his disciples, Peter and John, and said simply, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it." They asked the natural question, "Where?" His instructions were precise, in a way that must have seemed strange. He told them that when they entered the city, they would meet a man carrying a jar of water. They were to follow him into whatever house he entered, and say to the owner, "The teacher asks, 'Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?'" The owner would show them a large upper room, already furnished. They were to prepare it there. A man carrying a water jar. In first-century Jerusalem, carrying water was almost exclusively the work of women. Water jars were carried on the head or hip throughout the ancient Near East, and this was understood as women's work. A man carrying a water jar through the crowded streets of Jerusalem during the height of Passover preparations would have stood out immediately. A visible anomaly in a city, moving at full speed through familiar rituals. Jesus was giving Peter and John a signal that was impossible to miss, and impossible to confuse with anything else. Look for the one thing that does not fit the expected pattern. When you see it, follow it. They went. They entered the city, joining the thousands of pilgrims and residents moving through Jerusalem with their own preparations. They found the man, exactly as Jesus had described. They followed him. They spoke to the owner of the house, and the owner led them upstairs to a large, furnished room, already prepared, already waiting. Who was this man? Who owned this house? The text does not tell us. The owner is unnamed. The house is unidentified. Scholars have suggested various possibilities over the centuries, but the scripture holds the detail quietly and does not explain it. What we know with certainty is only this: when Jesus needed a room, there was a room. This is the second time in the same week that something was waiting exactly where he said it would be. Sunday it was a donkey, tied in a village, whose owners released it without argument when told the Lord had need of it. Thursday, it was a room, furnished and ready, whose owner opened it without hesitation when asked. The most significant week in human history was supported in its practical details by unnamed people who simply made what they had available and stepped back. Neither the owner of the donkey nor the owner of the upper room appears in the story again. Neither is named. They gave what they had, when it was needed, and that was enough. Peter and John set about the work of preparation. The Passover meal carried specific requirements reaching back to the instructions given in Exodus. Requirements that had been refined and elaborated over more than 1,000 years of practice into a carefully ordered ritual with nothing left to chance. The lamb had to be taken to the temple that afternoon and slaughtered according to the prescribed ritual. Ancient sources describe the scale of this as requiring the priests to work in long shifts throughout the day, the smoke of the offerings rising continuously over the city. Peter and John joined the thousands of others making this same journey, carrying their lamb into the temple courts, receiving back the portions that were theirs, then back to the upper room, the unleavened bread, matzah, prepared without yeast, connecting this meal directly to the hurried departure from Egypt, when there was no time for bread to rise. The bitter herbs, representing the bitterness of slavery. The charoset, a mixture of fruit, nuts, and wine, representing the mortar the Israelite slaves had used in building, and the 4 cups of wine, each tied to one of the 4 promises God had made to Israel in the book of Exodus. I will bring you out. I will deliver you. I will redeem you. I will take you as my people. 4 cups, 4 premies. The entire architecture of the meal built around the memory of rescue. But this meal was not merely a commemoration. And this is the part that changes everything about how Thursday evening should be understood. The Passover was designed, by its very structure, to be a participation. The Haggadah, the telling, the text recited at the Passover table, required the head of the household to say, In every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he personally left Egypt, not as if his ancestors left Egypt, as if he himself did. This was living memory. Present tense. The Passover table collapsed the distance between then and now, between the original rescue and the people eating this meal tonight, until there was no distance at all. Every person at that table was meant to understand themselves as someone who had been enslaved, someone who had been passed over, someone who had been brought out. Peter and John laid the table with all of it. They set out the cups and the bread and the herbs. They prepared everything the meal required. And in the late afternoon, as the sun began to lower toward the western hills and Jerusalem moved toward the sacred threshold of nightfall, Jesus arrived with the other 10 disciples. He walked up the stairs into the upper room. He looked at what had been prepared. He looked at the faces of the 12 men he had spent 3 years with, the fisherman, the tax collector, the doubter, the one who would deny him, the one who had already made his decision. He looked at all of them, and he said, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Earnestly desired. The Greek construction expresses intensity, a longing that matched the weight of what was about to happen within this evening, and because of it, he had wanted this room, this table, these people, this meal, before everything that was coming. Rest here for a moment. The room is ready. The table is set. Everything has been prepared by unnamed hands and willing owners and 2 disciples who followed a man carrying a water jar through a crowded city and trusted the instructions they had been given. You do not need to prepare anything tonight. Everything has already been made ready. Sleep now. The evening is just beginning. The meal began as it always began, with the first cup of wine lifted and blessed, declaring the holiness of this night above all others. The familiar words, the familiar ritual. 13 men in an upper room in Jerusalem, doing what Jewish families had done on this night for over 1,000 years. And yet nothing about this evening was ordinary, because the man lifting the cup knew what the night would contain. He knew that before the sun rose on Friday, one of the 12 men in this room would have handed him over to armed soldiers. He knew that the one who called himself the Rock would deny 3 times ever having known him. He knew that by the time the Passover lamb was being offered at the temple on Friday afternoon, he would be dying on a Roman cross outside the city walls. He knew all of this, and he lifted the cup and gave thanks. Partway through the meal, he rose from the table. He took off his outer robe. He wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began to wash the feet of his disciples. To understand what this meant, we need to understand the world it happened in. Foot washing in first-century Judea was not symbolic. It was practical necessity. The roads of Jerusalem were unpaved stone, crowded during Passover week with animals and everything that comes with them. People wore open sandals. By the time you arrived anywhere, your feet genuinely needed attention. But foot washing was not done by the master of the house. It was not done by the teacher. It was assigned to the lowest servant available, the one who ranked below everyone else in the household. Some rabbinic texts from this period suggest that even a disciple should not wash his teacher's feet, because the relationship carried too much dignity for that particular task. Jesus was the teacher. He was the one they called Rabbi and Lord. He was the one whose sandals John the Baptist had said he was not worthy to untie. And he was on his knees with a basin of water, washing road dust off the feet of fishermen. He came to Peter. Peter's response was entirely consistent with everything we know about him. "Lord, do you wash my feet?" The emphasis unmistakable. You, of all people, washing my feet. Of all things. Jesus said what he was doing could not be understood yet, but would be understood later. Peter said he would never allow it. Jesus said, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." And Peter, who never did anything by halves, reversed completely. "Lord, not my feet only, but my hands and my head." He washed all their feet, including the feet of Judas Iscariot, who had already counted out the silver. He knelt in front of the man who had traded his life for the price of a slave, picked up the basin, and washed the road dust from his feet. Then he returned to his place and said, "Do you understand what I have done? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." He was not offering a lesson in humility as an abstract virtue. He was dismantling the entire structure by which the world organized power and honor, and replacing it with a basin and a towel. In a world where your status determined every interaction, every space you were permitted to occupy, every table you were allowed to sit at, he took the position of the lowest servant and said, "This is what I look like. This is what you are to look like too." The meal continued. And then, in the middle of it, he said something that silenced the room. "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another. John tells us they were genuinely uncertain, questioning each other, confused. None of them immediately certain it wasn't themselves. Peter gestured to John, who was reclining next to Jesus, to ask who it was. John leaned close and whispered. Jesus said, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." He took a piece of bread, he dipped it, and he handed it to Judas. In the culture of the first century, the act of dipping bread and handing it to someone at the table was a gesture of honor, what a host did for a valued guest. Even here, at the precise moment of naming the betrayal, he extended friendship. He said quietly to Judas, "What you are going to do, do quickly." The others did not fully understand. Some thought he was sending Judas to buy supplies, or to give something to the poor. Judas left. The Gospel of John records 4 words after his departure that carry more weight than almost any sentence in any literature. And it was night. With Judas gone, Jesus began to speak. And what followed in that upper room is the longest, most intimate teaching in the entire gospel narrative. He called them little children, not disciples, not servants, not followers, little children, on the night of his in the room that Judas had just walked out of. He addressed the 11 with the tenderness of a parent who knows separation is coming and wants the people they love to carry something true into it. He gave them a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you. Not love one another when it is convenient. Not love one another according to what they deserve. Love one another the way he had just demonstrated, with basin and towel, with a seat at the table, even for the one who walked out into the night. Peter asked where he was going. Jesus told him he could not follow now, but would follow later. Peter insisted he would lay down his life. Jesus said, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly I say to you, the rooster will not crow until you have denied me 3 times." Peter did not believe it. Then came words that have crossed 2,000 years without losing a single degree of their warmth. "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you. I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Many rooms, a place prepared. I will come again. He spoke about the future as though it were already secured, as though what was about to happen in the next 12 hours was not an obstacle to the promise, but the very means by which the promise would be fulfilled. He said, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." Peace, spoken on the night of his betrayal, in the room that smelled of bread and wine and lamp oil, to 11 men who did not yet understand what was happening around them. His peace, not the absence of difficulty, something that could exist inside a night like this one and still be called peace. Breathe. Let the room hold you here for a moment before we follow him into the dark. The bread has been broken. The cup has been shared. The feet have been washed. And his voice is still saying, "Let not your heart be troubled. He meant it then. He means it now. Sleep well. After everything had been said, after the basin and the towel, after the bread and the dipped morsel, after let not your hearts be troubled, he prayed. What follows in John chapter 17 is unlike anything else in the gospel narrative. It is not a parable or a teaching or a response to a challenge. It is a prayer spoken aloud in a room with 11 witnesses, on the last night before everything changed. And because it was spoken aloud, we are able to do something extraordinary. We are able to overhear it, not read about it at a distance. Overhear it, the way you might pause in a hallway when you hear someone speaking in the next room with such complete honesty that you understand you are hearing something real. He lifted his eyes toward heaven and said, "Father, the hour has come." He prayed for himself first, not out of selfishness, but out of clarity. What was about to happen to him was the means by which everything else would be accomplished. He asked to be glorified, so that the Father might be glorified through him. He spoke about the work he had been given, and the fact that he had completed it. There is no anxiety in this prayer, no last-minute uncertainty. There is the settled tone of someone who has walked the whole road and can see the end of it clearly from where he now stands. Then he prayed for his disciples. "Holy Father, keep them in your name. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one." He prayed for their protection on the night they were about to scatter. He prayed for their unity on the night one of them had already walked out into the dark. He prayed for the people who were, within hours, going to fail him in almost every way. A person can fail someone they love, and he did not pray for them after they had proven themselves. He prayed for them now, tonight, in the room where the betrayal had already begun, and asked the Father to keep them anyway. There is something in that worth sitting with before we move forward. He did not pray for idealized versions of his disciples. He prayed for the actual ones, the frightened ones, the confused ones, the one who would deny him 3 times before sunrise. He brought them to the Father exactly as they were and asked for them to be held. Then, the prayer expanded. He prayed for everyone who would come after, everyone who would believe because of the testimony of those 11 men, everyone who would hear the message passed from voice to voice, across generations, across languages and centuries, and cultures that did not yet exist on the night this prayer was spoken. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. You were in that prayer, not as an abstraction, not as a category, but as someone specifically within the reach of what he was asking. On a Thursday night in Jerusalem, before the language you speak had the form it has now, before the country you live in existed, before your grandparents' grandparents were born, he lifted his eyes toward heaven and prayed for the people who would one day believe because of what was about to happen. He prayed that they would be one, that the unity he shared with the Father would somehow extend outward through history and hold together people who had never met, people separated by everything that separates human beings: language, geography, culture, centuries of distance, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you. The prayer ended. He stood. He said to the 11, "Rise. Let us go from here." They sang a hymn, the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 115 through 118, sung traditionally at the conclusion of the Passover meal. The same songs Jewish families had sung at the end of this same meal for centuries. Voices rising in an upper room in Jerusalem on the night of betrayal, singing ancient words about the steadfast love of the Lord that endures forever, about the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone, about the day the Lord has made. He sang before Gethsemane. He praised before the suffering. He put ancient words of trust in his mouth and sang them aloud in the company of 11 people who did not yet understand what they were walking toward. They came down from the upper room, down the stairs, out into the dark streets of Jerusalem. The city was quiet now. The Passover meals concluded in house after house, lamps burning low. Families settled into the particular stillness that follows a sacred meal eaten slowly. They moved through the streets toward the eastern gate. Through the gate, down into the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley cuts between the eastern wall of Jerusalem and the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. On the night of Passover, with a full moon overhead. Passover falls on the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which by definition is the night of the full moon. The white limestone of the temple walls reflected the light across the valley. The disciples would have had more light than on an ordinary night. They could see where they were walking. They could see the garden ahead of them on the lower slope of the mountain. The garden was called Gethsemane. The name in Aramaic means oil press. Most likely, a working olive grove, whose owner had given Jesus and his disciples permission to use as a place of rest and prayer on previous visits to Jerusalem. He had been here before. He knew the trees, the particular quiet of the place. The way the city sounds carried differently on this hillside than they did inside the walls. They crossed the valley and began to climb. The singing was finished. The conversation had grown quiet. Somewhere in the group, 11 men were walking toward something. None of them fully understood. And one of them, the one in front, understood it completely. He turned to 8 of the disciples and said, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and James and John a little further in, the 3 who had been closest to him through the most significant moments of the ministry. And then something happened that the gospel writers record with a care that tells us they understood they were writing down something that mattered enormously. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said to the 3, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." He went a little further. He fell on his face on the ground, and he prayed, "Breathe. The garden is quiet around you. The moon is full overhead. The city is visible across the valley, its lights still burning in the dark. And on the ground, in the olive grove, the one who had just prayed for you in the upper room was now praying for himself, with a honesty and a weight that the next section alone can hold. Rest here for a moment, at the edge of the garden. Before we go in, the singing is still faintly present, the last notes of the Hallel carried on the night air. The steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. He had just sung it. He was about to live it. Sleep now, if sleep is ready. The garden will still be there when you wake. He went a little further into the garden and fell on his face on the ground. The Greek words the gospel writers chose to describe what happened to him here are worth sitting with carefully, because they are not gentle words. Mark says he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. The first word describing a grief so heavy, it presses itself into the body. The second, describing the particular disorientation of someone who has arrived somewhere so extreme that their ordinary resources are simply not adequate for it. Matthew adds that he was sorrowful, even to death, a phrase that does not mean he was suicidal, but that the sorrow had reached a depth where the boundary between bearing it and being undone by it felt very thin. This is not a man performing anguish for the benefit of witnesses. The 3 disciples he brought further into the garden were already falling asleep. There was no audience for what happened here. What the gospel writers recorded was real. The full weight of a human being arriving at the outer edge of what can be carried, and bringing it honestly to the only place it could go. He prayed, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The cup. In the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Scriptures, the image appears repeatedly for something that carries the full weight of consequence, judgment, suffering, the concentrated reality of what sin costs. Most careful readers across centuries of interpretation have understood what Jesus was asking to be removed as something larger than physical suffering alone, though what he was about to endure physically was severe beyond ordinary description. He was about to take into himself everything that separates human beings from God, the full accumulation of human sin and its consequences, concentrated and carried by a single person who had never contributed to its contents. In the garden, in the dark, with the full moon overhead and his closest friends a stone's throw away already asleep, The complete reality of what that meant came upon him. Not the idea of it, the reality of it. And he asked if there was another way. This is prayer at its most essential and most honest. Not the performance of composure. Not arriving at the garden already resolved, already past the hard part, ready to demonstrate serenity. He brought the full truth of what he was experiencing to his Father without pretending it was something other than what it was. He told the truth about what he was feeling, and then he said nevertheless. And the nevertheless holds both things at once. The genuine desire for another way, and the genuine surrender to the way that is. It does not cancel the honesty that came before it. It completes it. He went back to Peter and James and John. They were asleep. So, could you not watch with me 1 hour? No anger beyond the quiet question. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. He understood what weakness felt like from the inside. He was experiencing the limits of human flesh in their most extreme form, in this very garden, on this very night. He extended to them the same mercy he was asking for himself. He went away a second time and prayed. The language had shifted slightly from the first prayer. My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. The first prayer asked whether the cup could pass. The second begins with the quiet acknowledgement that perhaps it cannot. He was moving through something, not from doubt to faith, because faith had never been absent, but from the initial impact of the full weight of what was coming, through honest wrestling, toward a surrender that was not resignation, but choice. Chosen with clear eyes, chosen freely. He came back. They were asleep again, their eyes heavy. Mark records with an almost tender honesty that they did not know what to say to him. What do you say to someone carrying something that no one else in the garden can fully share? There are no words adequate for that particular loneliness, and so they slept. He went away a third time and prayed the same words. Luke, who was a physician, includes a detail here that has drawn careful attention across centuries of reading. He writes that in his anguish, Jesus prayed more earnestly, and that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Whether understood as a precise medical description of a rare stress response, or as a powerful comparison conveying the intensity of what he was experiencing, what Luke is communicating is clear. The anguish in this garden was not abstract. It had pressed itself into the body. It was physical in its weight, visible in its cost. Luke also records that an angel appeared from heaven and strengthened him. Not rescue, not a way out. Strength to continue. Sometimes that is what comes in response to the most desperate prayers. Not the removal of the hard thing, but the capacity to walk through it. He came back to the disciples a third time. Sleep and take your rest later on, he said. And even here, in the middle of everything, the gentleness toward them is almost unbearable. The hour is at hand. Rise. Let us be going. Say, my betrayer is at hand. Even as he was speaking, noise broke the quiet of the garden. Torches visible through the olive trees. Lanterns. The sound of armed men moving through the undergrowth. A crowd sent by the chief priests and elders, carrying swords and clubs. And at the front of them, walking ahead of the soldiers through the garden, he knew the way through because he had been coming here for years, was Judas. He had arranged a signal with the soldiers beforehand. The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him. He walked directly to Jesus. Greetings, Rabbi. And he kissed him. Jesus said, Friend, do what you came to do. Friend, even now. Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, a man named Malchus, one of the only people healed during the Passion narrative to be named. Jesus said, Put your sword back. Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, who would send me more than 12 legions of angels? He was not captured because he was helpless. He was surrendering because surrender was the choice, made 3 times already on the ground in this garden, chosen freely each time. He reached out and healed the ear of Malchus. Then the disciples fled. Every one of them. He was alone now, his hands being bound by soldiers in a garden he had prayed in a city he had wept over, in a week he had walked into with clear eyes from the very beginning. Breathe. Let the garden grow quiet. The torches are moving away through the trees. Back toward the city. He chose this. 3 times on the ground. And once standing, looking Judas in the face and calling him friend. Whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever cup you have asked to have taken away, he knows what that prayer feels like from the inside. He prayed it himself, and then he chose anyway. Rest, now. The night is still his, and so are you. What happened between midnight and 9 in the morning on the Friday of Holy Week was, by almost any legal standard of its time, a procedural catastrophe. 6 separate hearings, 6 different authorities. A verdict decided before the first question was asked. A man moved from room to room through the dark hours of a Passover night, while the people conducting the proceedings understood perfectly well that what they were doing could not survive the scrutiny of daylight. They needed it finished before morning. The soldiers led him first to the house of Annas. Annas was one of the most powerful men in Jerusalem, perhaps the most powerful in the entire Jewish religious establishment. Despite not currently holding the title of high priest, he had served in that position before being removed by the Roman authorities, who held the power of appointment and dismissal over the role. But in the view of many Jewish people, the high priesthood was a lifetime appointment under the law, and Annas retained an authority in practice that exceeded his official title. His son-in-law Caiaphas held the position currently. The leadership of the temple moved through this family like a private inheritance. Annas questioned him about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus said, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me." It was a direct and legally reasonable response. Everything he had taught publicly. If there was evidence against him, it was available to anyone who had been paying attention. One of the officers standing nearby struck him across the face. "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus said, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas. The Sanhedrin had been assembled at the house of Caiaphas. An irregular night session, convened in darkness. During a feast, when such proceedings were technically prohibited under Jewish law, the council was searching for testimony against Jesus that would justify a death sentence. Various witnesses came forward. Their testimonies contradicted one another, which under Jewish law rendered them invalid. The proceedings were producing nothing usable. Finally, Caiaphas stood and addressed Jesus directly. "Have you no answer? What is it that these men testify against you?" Jesus said nothing. The silence in that room must have been extraordinary. A man standing before a council assembled in the middle of the night for the express purpose of ending his life. Offering them nothing, Caiaphas said, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Under Jewish law, if a person was placed under oath by the living God in a formal proceeding, silence was no longer available as a response. Jesus said, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." He answered clearly, without qualification, and with words drawn from 2 places in the Hebrew Scriptures. The right hand of power, from Psalm 110, and coming on the clouds of heaven, from the prophet Daniel. He was not merely claiming to be the Messiah in a political sense. He was claiming to be the figure of Daniel's vision, the one who receives an everlasting kingdom from the Ancient of Days. Caiaphas tore his robes, the traditional gesture on hearing blasphemy. "He has uttered blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." And some of them began to spit in his face, to strike him, to mock him. He received it all without a word. While this was happening inside, something was unfolding in the courtyard below. Peter had followed at a distance when the soldiers led Jesus from the garden. He had managed to get inside the high priest's courtyard and stood there, warming himself at a charcoal fire with the servants and officers, waiting. The way people wait when they do not know what else to do. A servant girl looked at him in the firelight. "You also were with Jesus, the Galilean." He denied it in front of everyone. Another servant girl saw him near the gateway and said to those nearby, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again, with an oath. A little later, some bystanders pressed the point. "Certainly you are one of them. Your accent betrays you." Galileans spoke with a distinctive regional inflection, recognizable immediately to anyone from Jerusalem. Peter invoked a curse on himself and swore, "I do not know the man." Immediately, a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered. The upper room, the table, the voice that had said it so specifically and so gently that Peter had refused to believe it was possible. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." He went outside and wept bitterly, not quietly. The word suggests something that broke through the surface entirely. Grief that could not be contained by the ordinary boundaries of a man who had always presented himself as the strongest one in the room. When morning came, the chief priests held a brief formal session to ratify the night's decision and led Jesus to Pontius Pilate. They would not enter his residence. Entering a Gentile building during Passover would make them ritually impure. They had spent the night arranging an illegal trial of an innocent man, and they were concerned about a doorway. Pilate questioned Jesus directly. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate went back out and told the crowd, "I find no guilt in him." Learning that Jesus was from Galilee, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who was in Jerusalem for the feast. Herod had wanted to see Jesus for years, hoping to witness some miracle. Jesus answered him nothing. Herod mocked him, dressed him in fine clothing as a joke, and sent him back. Pilate and Herod, previously at odds, became friends that day. Bonded by their shared handling of a man neither could find guilty of anything, Pilate tried once more to release him, offering the crowd a choice between Jesus and a man named Barabbas, imprisoned for insurrection and murder. He assumed they would choose Jesus. The chief priests worked the crowd. "Barabbas," Pilate said. "Then what shall I do with Jesus?" They shouted, "Crucify him." He asked what evil he had done. They shouted louder. A message arrived from Pilate's wife. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. I have suffered much because of him, today, in a dream." He had disturbed her sleep. He was about to disturb far more than that. Pilate took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood." The crowd answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." He released Barabbas. He handed Jesus over to be crucified. Breathe. 6 hearings. Every procedural safeguard broken. A governor who declared him innocent 3 times and handed him over anyway. A crowd that chose a murderer over a healer. And through all of it, not one word of self-defense. Not one appeal to his own power. Not one moment where he became something other than what he had always been. The trials are over. The road to Golgotha is ahead. Sleep now. He has already walked it. The soldiers took him into the courtyard of the governor's headquarters and gathered the whole battalion around him. What followed was not incidental to the execution. It was part of it. Roman flogging was a brutal preliminary to crucifixion, carried out with a whip whose leather strands were embedded with pieces of bone and metal designed to tear the skin. It was severe enough that men sometimes did not survive it. The gospel writers do not linger on the details. They record it in a single word: flogged, and move on. But the body that was led out of that courtyard afterward was not the same body that had walked in. The soldiers dressed him in a scarlet robe, a soldier's cloak, the closest thing available to royal purple. They wove thorns into a crown and pressed it onto his head. They put a reed in his right hand as a mock scepter. Then they knelt before him, one by one, in practice theatrical mockery. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him. They took the reed from his hand and struck him on the head with it, driving the thorns deeper. There is something important in what the soldiers were doing. Beyond the cruelty of it, they were performing a parody of exactly what was actually true. They were mocking a king while kneeling before a king. They dressed him in the color of royalty, while genuinely in the presence of the one the Passover crowd had rightly called the Son of David. The irony is not accidental. It runs through the entire Passion narrative like a thread. The people who understood least about who he was kept enacting, in their mockery, the truth they could not see. When they had finished, they stripped the robe off him and put his own clothes back on. They led him out. The condemned man was required by Roman practice to carry the crossbeam, the horizontal timber of the cross, to the place of execution. This was not a complete cross, but the patibulum, the piece that would be hoisted onto the upright post already fixed at Golgotha. It weighed somewhere between 30 and 40 kilograms. Under ordinary circumstances, a man in good health could carry it. These were not ordinary circumstances. He walked out under the weight of it, into the streets of Jerusalem. The city was moving around him. Passover week. Pilgrims everywhere. The ordinary noise of a city that did not stop for an execution. The route from the Praetorium to Golgotha passed through streets crowded with people who had come from every corner of the known world for the feast. Some of them would have recognized him. Some would have been in the crowd that shouted Hosanna 5 days earlier. Some were seeing him for the first time, somewhere on that road. Under the accumulated weight of everything the night and morning had cost, he fell. The soldiers needed the execution to proceed without delay. They could not wait. They looked at the crowd lining the road and grabbed a man. His name was Simon, from the city of Cyrene in North Africa, a city on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Libya, home to a significant Jewish community. He was coming in from the country. The Gospels tell us, arriving in Jerusalem, perhaps for the feast, certainly not knowing what he was walking into. One moment, he was a pilgrim making his way toward the city. The next, Roman soldiers had pulled him from the crowd and put the crossbeam on his shoulders. Simon of Cyrene did not choose to be in this story. He was conscripted into it on a Friday morning without warning or explanation. The weight he was given was not his. The road he was made to walk was not the one he had planned to walk that day. And yet the Gospel of Mark, writing for an audience in Rome, mentions something that most people read past entirely. That Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. 2 names, offered without explanation, as though the readers would know exactly who these men were, which means they did. Which means Simon's sons were known in the early church, known well enough that their father's name could be used to identify them, rather than the other way around. A man pulled from a crowd on a Friday morning in Jerusalem, made to carry a cross he had not chosen, went home and told his family what had happened. And his family never forgot it. And his sons became people the early church knew by name. The weight Simon carried that morning changed his life and the lives of the people he loved. Not because he chose it, because it was placed on him without warning, on a road he happened to be walking. Among the crowd following the procession were women, weeping, mourning openly as the column moved through the streets. Luke records that Jesus turned to them on that road, not to the soldiers, not to the religious leaders who had engineered the night's proceedings. To the women weeping along the route, he said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." And he spoke again, as he had from the Mount of Olives earlier in the week, about days coming upon the city that would bring devastation. Even on that road, even in that condition, his attention turned outward. He was thinking about what was coming for them. He was concerned, in the middle of his own suffering, about theirs. This is the shape of a love that does not turn inward, even under the most extreme pressure imaginable. He had washed feet on Thursday. He had prayed for his disciples in the upper room, while one of them was already gone. He had called Judas friend in the garden. And now, carrying the weight of a cross through the streets of Jerusalem, he turned to the women weeping for him and redirected their grief towards something he could see that they could not yet. They reached the place called Golgotha, an Aramaic word meaning the place of the skull. It sat outside the city walls, on an exposed rise of ground near one of the main roads into Jerusalem, chosen by the Roman authorities specifically for its visibility. Crucifixion was not only an execution, it was a message, displayed where as many people as possible would see it. A warning written in human suffering, meant to be read by everyone who passed. They offered him wine mixed with gall, a bitter mixture, sometimes given to condemned men. He tasted it and refused. He would face what was coming with a clear mind and open eyes. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. Breathe. The road has been walked. The hill has been reached. A man who fell under the weight of a cross still arrived at the place he was going. Nothing that happened on that road, not the flogging, not the mockery, not the falling, not the borrowed shoulders of a stranger, prevented him from arriving. Sleep now. What happens on the hill is the center of everything, and the center will hold. They crucified him at 9 in the morning, above his head. Pilate had ordered a sign fixed to the cross, written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that every person in Jerusalem, regardless of background or origin, could read it. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The chief priests went back to Pilate and objected, "Do not write the King of the Jews. Write that he said he was king." Pilate said, "What I have written, I have written." The sign stayed. The 3 languages covered the known world, the sacred language of the Jewish people, the administrative language of the empire, the common language of trade and culture. Every tongue represented at the moment the cross was raised. On either side of him, 2 criminals were crucified at the same time. The crowd that gathered did what crowds at Roman executions did. Some watched in silence. Some mocked. The chief priests and scribes and elders passed beneath the cross and said, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him." The soldiers joined in. Even one of the criminals crucified beside him hurled insults. They were not entirely wrong about what they were observing. He could have come down. He had said so in the garden. 12 legions of angels available at a word. The reason he did not come down was not inability. It was the same choice he had made on the ground in Gethsemane. Made again now. From the cross. "Nevertheless, your will be done." He stayed. And from the cross, over the course of 6 hours, he spoke 7 times. Every word given outward. Not one turned inward in self-pity or complaint. Even here, even now, he was giving. The first word came almost immediately, while the soldiers were still crouching at the foot of the cross, dividing his garments among themselves and casting lots for his tunic, fulfilling, without knowing it, the exact words of Psalm 22, written 1,000 years before this morning. He looked down at them and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Not after the fact, not from a safe distance. While it was happening, while the nails were fresh, and the men who had put them there were gambling over his clothing a few feet below him, he prayed for the people killing him while they were in the process of killing him. If you have ever wondered whether the forgiveness this cross offers is real, whether it actually extends to the worst things human beings are capable of, this is your answer. Spoken in real time. While the event was still in progress, the second word was spoken to the man dying beside him. At some point during those hours, one of the 2 criminals underwent a change that the text does not explain and does not need to. He silenced the other, acknowledged his own guilt plainly, and then turned to Jesus and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." A request with nothing behind it. No credentials. No history of faithfulness. No time remaining to demonstrate anything. Just the request itself. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Not someday. Not after sufficient waiting or demonstrated worthiness. Today, the door that had seemed permanently closed opened in the last hour. Or a man who had nothing to offer but the asking. The third word was spoken to his mother. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee had not fled. They were there, at a distance first, then closer as the hours passed. Mary, his mother, was among them. And John, the disciple he loved, stood with her. Jesus looked down and saw her. He said to her, "Woman, behold your son." And to John, "Behold your mother." Even from the cross, provision was being made. He was thinking about what she would need when it was over, arranging her future, ensuring she would not be left alone, caring for the person he loved from a place where caring required everything he had left to give. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the land. 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day, over a city full of Passover pilgrims who had come from every corner of the world. The Gospels record it as fact. What produced it? How it lasted 3 hours? The text does not explain. What it created was a darkness that matched what was happening, an external sign of an internal weight that had no ordinary measure. The fourth word came from within that darkness. At 3 in the afternoon he cried out, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? The opening words of Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in the depths of felt abandonment and moves, over its full length, toward confident praise. He was not quoting scripture as a performance. He was praying it from the inside, living it in real time, bringing the full truth of what he was experiencing to the Father without softening it. Most careful readers across centuries have understood this cry as expressing something beyond physical suffering. He was bearing the full weight of human sin and its consequences. And sin, by its nature, separates. It separates the human heart from the holy presence. He was experiencing from the inside what sin does, not his own. There was none, but the sin he was carrying, and he cried out about it with complete honesty. But Psalm 22 does not end in abandonment. It ends with praise, with the declaration that God has not hidden his face from the suffering one, that he has listened to the cry. He prayed through the darkness all the way to that ending. The fifth word was simple: I am thirsty. A jar of sour wine was nearby. Someone held a sponge, soaked in it up to his mouth. He received the drink. He was thirsty. He was human. He said so. The sixth word is the one that contains everything. Tetelestai. It is finished. In the Greek commercial world of the first century, this word appeared on records of payment when a debt had been completely and fully settled. Nothing remaining. Nothing outstanding. Paid in full. He was not saying I am defeated. He was declaring the work complete. The debt that no human being could settle on their own behalf. Cleared entirely. Whatever you have been afraid to look at, whatever weight has felt too large and too permanent to ever be fully addressed. The sixth word is for you, not because you earned it, because he said it. The seventh and final word was a prayer. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Words drawn from Psalm 31, a psalm that Jewish children were taught to recite as a bedtime prayer before sleep, the last words before closing their eyes. The entrusting of the self to the care of God through the dark hours. He died with a child's bedtime prayer on his lips. The curtain of the temple tore, from top to bottom. Not from bottom to top. Top to bottom is the direction of hands reaching down, not up. What it had separated for centuries. The ordinary from the most holy. The human from the divine presence. Was separated no longer. The Roman centurion who had commanded the crucifixion looked at everything that had happened and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." The last voice we hear before the body is taken down. A Roman soldier. The representative of the empire that had just executed him. Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body. Nicodemus came with spices. The same Nicodemus who had come to Jesus at night years before with his careful questions. Who had stayed in the background of the story ever since. and who came into the open now. At the end, they wrapped the body in linen with the spices, placed him in a new tomb, cut from rock in a nearby garden, rolled the stone against the door, and left. 2 women sat across from the tomb and watched where he was laid. The hill was quiet. The crowd was gone. 7 words. Everyone spoken outward. Everyone still speaking. Sleep now. Saturday is one more day, and Sunday is already coming. There is no chapter in Holy Week harder to inhabit than this one, not because it contains the most suffering. Friday carried more suffering than any other day in the story, not because it contains the most drama. Thursday evening carried drama that no one could have invented. Saturday is difficult because it contains something more disorienting than suffering and more unsettling than drama. It contains the specific, particular silence of the day between death and resurrection. The silence of a sealed tomb. The silence of people who have watched the worst thing happen and have not yet received any indication that it is not in fact the final thing. The silence of a world that does not know yet, that cannot know yet, that has to wait through an entire day of not knowing. Most of us know what that feels like. The day after the diagnosis, when treatment has not yet begun. The day after the loss, when the grief is new and raw and has not yet been softened by any passage of time. The day after the failure, when you do not yet know whether anything will be rebuilt from what remains. The day between what has ended and what has not yet come. Saturday is that day, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed through. The disciples were scattered. After the arrest in the garden, they had fled, every one of them, just as he had said they would. Peter had followed at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, denied knowing Jesus 3 times around a charcoal fire, and gone out weeping into the dark. John had been at the cross, standing with Mary and the other women. The rest had disappeared into the city, into whatever shelter was available to men who were frightened and grieving, and who had just watched everything they had given 3 years of their lives to end on a hill outside the city walls. On Saturday they were hiding. The Gospel of John, written with the perspective of decades, tells us that after the resurrection, the disciples were gathered with the doors locked for fear of the authorities. It is reasonable to assume that fear was present already on Saturday, pressing and immediate, not yet softened by any resolution. The man they had followed had been executed as an enemy of the state. They were his known associates. Being identified as a disciple of Jesus on Saturday in Jerusalem was not a comfortable identity to carry. Peter was somewhere in the city with 3 denials and a rooster's crow living inside him. The weight of those 3 moments around a charcoal fire, the weight of having looked someone in the eye and said, "I do not know the man," was the kind of weight that does not lighten quickly. Peter had always been the loudest one, the most insistent, the one who said he would die before he denied. And he had denied 3 times. Before sunrise, John was with Mary, the mother of Jesus, because Jesus had given her into his care from the cross. They were together somewhere in the particular quiet of people who have been through something too recent and too large to have found any words for yet. 2 people sitting in the aftermath of Friday, each carrying a grief the other could not fully reach. The women were being practical. We know this because early on Sunday morning, they were already on their way to the tomb with spices prepared and ready, which means they had spent at least part of Saturday making arrangements, deciding what to bring, preparing the mixture, thinking through the logistics of a task that grief had not excused them from. They were planning how to complete the burial rites that Friday's urgency had not allowed. They were thinking practically about a dead man because that was the next faithful thing available to them. And so they did it. That is what Saturday asks of you. The ordinary, terrible practicality of continuing to function in the presence of a grief that has not been resolved. You still have to buy the spices. The grief does not pause while you attend to the requirements of being alive. Now, here is the detail most people overlook entirely when they think about Holy Week Saturday. The detail that changes the texture of the day considerably. The chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate on the Sabbath, the day of prescribed rest, the day they were not supposed to conduct business or make formal requests of government authorities. They broke their own Sabbath restrictions and went to the Roman governor. They said, "Sir, we remember how that deceiver said, while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead." They remembered. After everything, after the trials, after the sleepless night, after the crucifixion, after the burial, they remembered clearly enough to take action against it. They were concerned enough about the possibility of resurrection to break their own religious rules on the most sacred day of the week to prevent it. The disciples, as far as the gospel accounts suggest, were not sitting in a locked room actively expecting Sunday morning. They were hiding. They were grieving. They were not apparently rehearsing what to do when he rose. The people most urgently preparing for the possibility of resurrection on Saturday were the people who had arranged the crucifixion. Pilate said, "You have a guard. Go. Make it as secure as you can." They went. They sealed the stone with a Roman seal and set soldiers to guard it. They did everything available to them. They brought the full authority of Rome to bear on a sealed cave, cut from rock in a garden outside the city walls. It was not enough, but we are not there yet. The sealed tomb sat through the afternoon. The guards stood at their posts. The stone did not move. The sun moved across the sky the way it always does, indifferent to the weight of what the day contained. Inside a sealed cave, either something was happening that has no precedent in human experience, or the story was simply over. Saturday does not tell you which. Saturday offers only the choice to keep waiting or to stop. Your life has long Saturdays, days that stretch further than they should, silences that outlast your capacity to sit comfortably inside them, spaces between what has ended and what has not yet arrived that feel less like pauses and more like permanent conditions. The women who prepared their spices and observed the Sabbath did not know Sunday was coming. They had no promise they were consciously holding. They simply did the next faithful thing and waited, and in their faithfulness, without knowing it, positioned themselves to be the first people in history to receive the news that changed everything. You do not always know on your Saturdays that Sunday is coming. You only know what they knew, that the next faithful thing is still worth doing, that the tomb is still worth going to, even when you do not know what you will find there. He is not absent from your Saturday. The stone is in place. The guards are at their posts. The silence is real, and he has never once stayed in a tomb. Rest now. The night is almost over. The women are already awake, already gathering their spices, already moving through the last darkness before the first day of the week begins. You do not need to move yet. Let them go ahead. Sunday will still be Sunday when you open your eyes. Sleep well. The silence is almost finished. The darkness before dawn is the deepest darkness there is, not the darkness of midnight, which has a settled quality, the world fully given over to night, comfortable in its own stillness. The darkness before dawn is different. It is the darkness that exists in the last hour before everything changes, the darkness that does not yet know it is about to end. Mary Magdalene walked through that darkness toward the tomb. She was not alone. The other gospel accounts mention other women with her. Mary, the mother of James. Salome. Others who had prepared spices and spent the Sabbath waiting. They had been awake before the city stirred. They were moving through the streets of Jerusalem toward the garden outside the city wall, where they had watched the stone rolled into place 2 days before. They were talking about the stone as they walked. Who will roll it away for us from the entrance of the tomb? A practical problem they had not solved. The stone was large, described in terms suggesting it was notably substantial. They were not strong enough to move it themselves and had made no arrangements for help. They were walking toward an obstacle they did not know how to get past, because the alternative was not going at all, and not going was not something any of them was willing to consider. They went anyway, toward the obstacle, into the darkness. With their spices and their grief and their unanswered question about the stone, they arrived at the tomb and looked up. The stone had been rolled away, the Roman seal broken, The guards gone. No human hand present among them had moved it. Matthew, writing from a slightly broader vantage point, describes what had occurred just before their arrival. A great earthquake. An angel descending. The stone rolled back, not to let Jesus out, but to let the witnesses in. The guards had trembled and fallen like dead men. The stone that the full authority of Rome had sealed was gone. Mary Magdalene ran. She did not stay to examine the tomb carefully or process what she was seeing. She ran back toward the city to find Peter and John. And when she found them, she said the only thing that made sense to her in that moment: "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Her first interpretation of the empty tomb was not resurrection. It was theft. Someone had moved the body. The empty tomb, by itself, on that first Sunday morning, was not good news to Mary Magdalene. It was a new crisis, layered on top of an already unbearable loss. She had come to do the last faithful thing available to her. And now even that had been taken away. Peter and John ran. John was faster and arrived first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen cloths lying there, but did not go in. Peter arrived and went straight inside. Entirely consistent with everything we know about him. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the other cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Folded, set aside deliberately. Not the scattered wrappings of a body hastily removed. Something else entirely. John went in after Peter, and he records 4 words about himself that carry the weight of a life changed in a single moment. He saw and he believed. Not yet understanding the scripture. He writes, not yet having a complete theological framework for what the empty tomb meant, but something in what he saw was sufficient. The cloths lying as they were. The folded face cloth set apart. Something in the details spoke before understanding arrived. He believed. Peter and John returned to their homes, but Mary stayed. She stood outside the tomb weeping. As she wept, she stooped to look inside and saw 2 figures in white sitting where the body had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." She turned around. A man was standing there in the early morning light. Through her tears, in the gray half-light before full sunrise, she did not recognize him. She assumed he was the gardener, the person responsible for this property. He said, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Even now, even weeping, she was working the problem, thinking practically, figuring out what could still be done. She was the woman who had prepared the spices, arrived before sunrise. Run to find Peter and John. Give her a task and she would do it. Tell her where the body was and she would go there. He said one word, "Mary," and she knew. Not because it was a signal or a code, because of the way he said it. The particular quality of a voice that knows you completely, that has always known you. That said your name long before this morning, in this garden. She turned. She said, "Rabboni," teacher. She knew him by his voice saying her name. He said, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Go." She was the first person in human history to receive the news of the resurrection. And she was sent, not told to wait, not asked to defer to those who might understand better. Sent, "Go and tell." She ran back into the city and found the disciples and said, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said. That Sunday, 2 other disciples walked 7 miles from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus, describing to a stranger who had joined them on the road everything that had happened over the past week. They were walking through their grief. speaking it aloud to someone who listened, and then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, opened the scriptures to them in a way that made their hearts burn within them. A warmth felt before understanding arrived. A recognition in the chest before the mind caught up. He broke bread with them at the table that evening. Their eyes were opened. They recognized him, and he was gone. They got up immediately and walked the 7 miles back to Jerusalem in the dark to tell the others. He had been with them the entire road. They had not known it. Their hearts had burned anyway. That evening, the disciples were gathered behind locked doors. Jesus came and stood among them. "Peace be with you." He showed them his hands and his side. They were overjoyed. He breathed on them, the same image as Genesis, the breath of God bringing life, and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Thomas was not there. He refused to believe until he could see the wounds himself. 8 days later, Jesus came again, and Thomas was present. Jesus said, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. That blessing is for you. You were not in the upper room. You did not walk the road to Emmaus or touch the wounds. You have the testimony of the witnesses, the account of the empty tomb, and the particular warmth that sometimes rises in the chest when the words of the story are opened up slowly in the quiet of a room at the end of a long day. He called that faith. He called it blessed. The resurrection does not answer every question. It does not explain why suffering exists or why Saturdays last as long as they do. It does not make the grief disappear or the confusion resolve overnight. What it does is this: it establishes, in the most concrete and irreversible terms available, that death is not the final word, that the worst thing that can happen is not the last thing that will happen, that the stone can be rolled away, that the voice that knows your name has not gone silent. The empty tomb is the answer to every Saturday. Not an explanation, an answer. He is reason, and he knows your name. You have walked every step of this week, the road from Galilee, the voices singing on the hillside, the table where feet were washed and bread was broken, the garden where the cup was accepted, the cross where every word was given outward, the tomb where the stone was gone before anyone arrived to move it. You have been through all of it, and you have not walked a single step of it alone. It is late now. The week is complete. The work is finished. The tomb is empty. Rest now. Beloved, he is reason. He knows your name, and he has never once stopped.